Hi everybody, welcome back to the online lending technology think tank. My name's Colin White from Credit Connect Media. Thanks for joining us. Just wanted to let you know we've had two sessions this morning you've missed called Digital Business Transformation and Credit Risk. Really good, really informative. They've been recorded, so feel free to have a look at those recordings when they're available, which should be in the next 24 hours if you missed them and you're interested in those subjects. For those of you who just joined us, we're just going to be talking about affordability and the customer journey. But before we go into a bit more detail about that and hand you over to our event chair, just want to let you know that as with all of our online events, we always want to get the audience involved as much as possible. So you've got, if you look at your panel in front of you, you've obviously got the video on the right. On the left, you've got an information button that's got information on this session. Also information where you can log into our next session, which will be live at 1 p.m. And that will discuss open banking and the future of lending. And you will need to log into that session separately. So the login details are all there. Most important bit on the panel in front of you, though, is the question speech bubble. We'd love for you to all ask some questions as and when you feel like you want to ask them in this session. So please do that, and we'll share them with our panel. If we don't manage to cover it, we'll write a review on the event and cover them off in the review, which will be available on the Credit Connect website next week. Another part, we will be sharing some polls throughout. So if you can take part in them, that would be excellent. They're anonymous. We collate the results. We don't share individual results. So please feel free and have some confidence in sharing your thoughts in that particular element, if nothing else. And then further information is on there about our speakers. You can download some information about some articles and some case studies and things like that on our platform. And then find out more about this session is really kindly sponsored by Alvaria. So there's some information on them, and we've got one of our panelists joining us today. So let's carry on with the event and talk about affordability in the customer journey. I'm joined once again by the event chair, Chris Warburton from our strategy. Chris is going to introduce the questions and, more importantly, introduce us to the panel, and then we can get started and go from there. So Chris, hand back to you. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Colin. Welcome back, everyone. Welcome to the new people who just joined us. So this session here is about affordability in the customer journey. And today we've got a great panel of four speakers. We've got Tim Sykes, who's the head of internal audit at Think Money. Hey, Tim. We've got Anna Roughley, who's the head of insight at Lending Standards Board. We've got Francis McInnes, who's a brand and communication specialist at Evergreen Finance. And we've got Don Hudecek, who's a senior product manager at Alvaria. So welcome everyone. Thanks very much for joining us. And I think, just to start this session, I mean, with the pandemic, I think from a customer point of view, I mean, a lot of customers' lives have sort of been turned upside down over the last sort of like year or so. Some have definitely been hit with financial hardship. They've had lost income. They've had reduced job prospects. Others seem to have got stable incomes and have even saved money with all the remote working. So we've sort of had quite a strange sort of good sort of year or so. And it's brought other things like when we've been working remote, some people have got feeling disconnected or having isolation. So there's that vulnerability angle that's come through as well. So really, we're going to sort of explore all of that today in terms of the customer journey, assessing affordability, at the front end, and what does it mean for us? What does it mean in terms of potential vulnerability, and how can technology, in particular, help us sort of navigate that sort of going forward? So to start off, I suppose, the first question really to start off is really, I suppose, emerging from the pandemic, how do you think the assessment of affordability and identifying potential vulnerable customers at an early stage, how do you think it's going to change? And Anna, do you want to take that first question? You're probably quite well placed to talk about that.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm happy to open up with that one. And as you quite rightly say, the pandemic has impacted the whole country, and obviously some have had the worst experiences and worse than others. And whilst the health impact can be devastating, there's also that potential of financial difficulties that impacted millions, whether that be through loss of jobs or they were unable to work or were furloughed. So COVID's also created a time of real uncertainty, and that's one that we're still in now. And if we think back to when the first lockdowns ended, I think many of us thought, that was the end of it. And sadly, the rules had to change again. when the infections began to rise. And many people thought that they'd be able to get back on track with their finances, and unfortunately would have been plunged back into difficulties. So I think emerging from the pandemic, that's the major takeaway here, that life can change very quickly and we never actually know what's around the corner. Hopefully nothing as significant, serious as this across the whole piece. But for this reason, firms' approaches to affordability and vulnerability really need to be adaptable and both proactive and reactive. Being proactive may involve, considering the data and the insight that's available to identify those who may be in difficulty or requiring that additional support. And being reactive for us really means when a customer reaches out for help, that we're sure that the right support is there for them. Firms should realise that it's unlikely that a customer's situation is not going to change between the application stage and then them ending their customer journey with them. Whatever that product is, change is not only possible, but it really is likely, and that we need to make sure that firms are adaptable and ready to support customers or tailor their journey as necessary.
And I suppose, Francis and Tim, I mean, how do you sort of see that in terms of like almost like your customer journeys and sort of embedding that in? Because, I mean, what are your kind of views on that in terms of what's happened and what do we need to think about from a journey point of view? We can't hear you. Tim, do you want to take the question?
Yeah, I'll jump in. Sorry, Francis.
I'll let you jump in. That's all right.
That's okay. Yeah, I mean, I think as Jenny Anna rightly said, the upheaval that's gone through everyone's life over the last 18 months and even 2 years, as kind of the way I think about this is it's just elevated the level of risk that we see. I mean, uncertainty equals risk, certainly from an internal audit perspective and a control perspective. And when you're talking about things like affordability, when it comes to the kind of the nuts and bolts of things like checking affordability, doing affordability checks, some companies that I've seen in the past have looked at things like 18-month time horizons for doing those checks. Well, that in the current circumstances isn't going to be necessarily a suitable benchmark to look at, because the last 18 months have been very variable, very different for a lot of people. So as was touched on there, being adaptable and being able to see people as individuals and being able to take into maybe the more softer metrics in terms of, instead of just looking at the raw data of income, outcome, credit checks, things that have happened in the last 18 months, that's not really going to necessarily give you a full picture of someone's affordability risk. Either when you're onboarding them or whether they've got a change in circumstances, or if you're looking at a more future focus. So I think that's really where it comes into really taking a very adaptable and very personal approach, where it really comes in. As far as that's possible anyway, when we're trying to assess affordability for at scale for a large number of either existing or new customers.
And Francis, we lost you at the start there. I mean, what was your kind of view? And I suppose, how do you link that back to the customer experience as well?
Okay, so I mean, Evergreen Finance, it really it gave us even more of a laser focus, I think, with everyone on the actual customer, and I think it's encouraged everyone to really view the customer through that lens and in detail. What is that individual customer specific circumstances? And relating to what you said, it's enabled us to look at more data outside the traditional credit risk modelling perspective, and actually looking at more softer metrics and demographics to try and anticipate who is going to be affected and how. At Evergreen Finance, for example, within about a week, the team created a COVID algorithm which used more softer data points. So, for example, job title and industry, to try and correlate that with who would be more vulnerable, and implemented that. And that helped to reduce mispayment rate, which is now being used today. So it's sort of accelerated in a very positive way, a more detailed look at the individual customer and taking into account more data. So really, I think it's changed that whole perspective on looking at the customer in more detail and vulnerability outside the traditional risk approach.
And do you think it's sort of like the technology becomes an enabler for that? I mean, so we've gone to it in these times, but is it becoming an enabler for that? And then Don, I'll come to ask you a bit about the experience piece, but is it becoming an enabler for that?
So we found that now furloughs ended. We're still we've integrated that algorithm on top of our existing algorithm, which and we're able to make better predictions based on that by looking at who's vulnerable. So it's kind of encouraged us, and I think a lot of lenders to really look at more data points. And obviously then that increases and improves our outcomes in terms of providing the right people with the right finance.
So I suppose, Don, in terms of the customer experience through that sort of, I suppose, the onboarding process in particular, I mean, digital's obviously been a big theme that's come through. We've had to do things in new ways. I mean, how have you seen that change?
I think it's more been a forcing function for our customers who are lending institutions, and for both their customer care or collections departments, how you treat it. But for example, a lot of our customers are trying to view their collections department more as a payment reminder department, as well as taking advantage of the technology that actually has been available for quite some time, but processes have been stayed and stable and unwilling to change because that's how things have always been done. And it's getting, sorry for my voice, getting back to the treating people as individuals, they're depending on how people are engaged or not. For example, certain instances, they may want more of a transactional interaction, so more self-service and things of that nature, where it's the customer feels more engaged. They don't want to provide their account number to a person, or if it's related to onboarding someone, a social or information regarding that, and they feel more comfortable providing that to a system versus not. But then again, now if you're dealing with more complex issues as far as their situation, why they may be backed up in their payments and things of that nature, they want to engage with people. They want to talk to people. They want to have the ability to have a longer conversation to resolve their situation versus having an interaction that's based on what's your average handle time. Those metrics don't work anymore. So it's trying to shunt transactional to better support the customer, to leave your agents, your customer care folks having more time to have a true interaction with somebody, and supporting that whole type of engagement.
So one of the questions actually came up in one of the previous sessions around frictionless journeys and how much of a frictionless journey should be. Is it a competitive advantage or not? Versus, I suppose, from the credit risk point of view, is getting extra information, but it's definitely an advantage from a customer point of view. And is it a competitive advantage in getting more customers to a particular business as well? I mean, Don, maybe just expand a little bit on some what you said in terms of like what's your kind of view on that, and then we'll go to the rest of the panel.
Well, customer switching costs are extremely low. I mean, they can go from one financial institution to another in less than a day. It's before it was onerous. Now it's not. Their options are broad and expansive. And everyone, it's whether it's in financial institutions, whether it's switching your phone, it's frictionless to switch. So providing, and it's not just frictionless engagement, it's supportive engagement. Are you providing a value to the person? Essentially, is your company, can your customers use your company? Just like how well do they use a one phone versus another, one app versus another? Do you provide supporting information so that they can, use your company as a way to, improve their lives? Whether that's, if they're in financial dire straits, helping them out of that. How do you get out of that? If they are trying to, actually start a business or have, gain capital, how well do you support them? What is your match of your company or your particular mix of products for those customers? That helps it. So it's not just frictionless. It's how do you actually help support what they're trying to accomplish in their lives? And how do you manage that mix of how you engage with your customers?
And I suppose Anna, you'd probably agree with some of that in terms of like just making sure it's customer centric, and it's the frictionless piece becomes a fallout from that, but it's customer centricity, I'd imagine.
Yeah, absolutely. just thinking about the frictionless piece as well, because I suppose as an industry, we talk about when we need to put an intervention in or a step in place, that creates that friction in the journey that we know about. But actually, the customer doesn't necessarily know that there's been friction in that process that has been added, do they? And obviously, and to Don's point, is around that customer support aspect, and it is needed at times. So I think also is sort of when we're, you know, designing our products and our journeys, is just thinking about, you know, some of the hot topics that there are at the moment around disclosure, for example, is how can we make this process easier, make it some awareness for customers. So it might feel like there's a bit of friction, but the customer's not experiencing, if that kind of makes sense, and because they don't know what to expect. And I think, you know, absolutely, Don, you said, you know, we've come a long way from the days when you sort of sit in your bank manager's office and you're discussing your loan requirements and your ability to repay. So I think that really one of the factors that affects the decision making and technology is the types of lending that we discuss as well. So, you know, the credit decision on a low balance credit card is very different to that of an overdraft on a business account. And those differing needs that firms need to build into these new approaches to make sure that they're suitable for all customers. So I think being able to improve the efficiency of a credit decision is great, but it needs to be great for all rather than a certain cohort of customers, so that others aren't left behind. And that feeds into your point really there, Chris, around being customer centric.
Yeah, and I suppose for going to Tim and Francis, really around, I mean, how much of an advantage, competitive advantage is it to have, you know, low touch processes, given the fact that you might have to do some of this from a risk or from a compliance point of view to be able to do it? And how do you sort of manage that balance as well? Because there's a balance there between cost and compliance versus, you know, giving almost like a seamless automated service, which can be sort of competitive.
If I say so, we very much focusing on the importance of collaboration. So you have to take every factor into account, because you know you can affect something can be good for underwriting, obviously, but then that can affect the customer experience. So I think it's very important that you have cross-functional teams and that the right information is taken into account. I think also it's a case of making sure you automate and create the right, you know, frictionless journey when you can, but that human intervention and you know, actually intervening at the right time. You have that human touch at the right time, and now we're at the stage where we can be smarter, so we can automate the relevant bits. We can then, for example, provide our underwriters with, based on a multiple data source, internal, external, CRH. So we can now give our underwriters, for example, the information they need, facilitated by data and predictive analytics. So when it comes to the point of making a decision, we're in a better position to do that, and we can interact at the right time when it's right for the customer.
Yeah, and Tim, maybe just comment around, when do you think is the right time? When is the right time, and what are your thoughts around when to engage people in the underwriting decisions versus doing automated kind of process, or when to have it frictionless versus not?
Well, I mean, so there's no doubt that certainly the expectations of customers now are, you know, within a minute you should have a decision. That's certainly the way that perceptions go. Even more so during the last 18 months, when everyone has now got a bigger expectation of online presence and online availability of getting basically anything. I think the friction comes, or the problem comes, when you want to have a truly frictionless experience for a customer, is that places all of the risk for assessing affordability and assessing, I mean, it's always with the business, but it puts much more onus on the lender in order to make those decisions in a smart way. I mean, you can come up with 100 scenarios where a true frictionless process is not possible. If you believe there's a risk that someone is going to be borrowing money from you just to buy into some crypto, then that's a very high level of affordability risk that you have to take into account. And it's not, you can't necessarily get that from pure data that you might get from a credit file or from other expenses. So there's so much new stuff that's emerging online. There's a potential risk that customers could engage in, and that makes it more challenging for one, businesses to make smart affordability decisions, and two, to make that experience truly frictionless. So I don't think there is a scenario where enabling people to go through all the necessary identity checks, fraud checks, and with new, online account accessibility, if you're going down that way, and you've got new regulations like PSD2, strong customer authentication coming in. These things make frictionless experiences for customers much more difficult. And from the flip side, from a business, much more expensive to implement and harder to implement in a smart way. So I think there's still some way to go with all these new emerging technologies that are coming out and for businesses to get this right.
And we're quite reliant on data for a lot of the automation that comes through.
Absolutely,
I mean, is there a sense of like you can have too much data and not send it to a human, or is it, or can you get lost in the data even as well?
I think you can certainly get lost in the data. There's so much availability on anyone now. I mean, it's almost scary how much information you can find for someone online through perfectly legitimate channels. I'm not talking about data mining or anything like that, but I think there is a question of analysis by paralysis is certainly possible. I've always taken the approach from a risk management perspective of kind of pick some metrics that work for your target demographic of customers and for your business model. And you can use those and refine them over time to make sure they're accurate based on experience, rather than try and get all data on all people and then try and make an informed decision on that, because I don't think that works very well. You just tend to be
I second that. I second that in terms of data is only as good as the meaning it offers. Data, if it's not being used properly, it adds no value. And it's really important when integrating new data sources, as we've found, we're very hot on integrating a new data source, but only rolling that out in a small sample, seeing how that affects outcomes, and doing that in a step-by-step way. With custom APIs, we've done that by putting a bit of data in, putting a new data source in, and making sure that doesn't have an impact, and making sure that you do that in a very careful way. Obviously, then you want to do that in a step-by-step way. Endless data obviously is not going to, they can't be used properly, doesn't add value.
And there's always sorry, I don't mean to take it off anyone else, but there's always a friction or a conflict between, you need to, by necessity, implement certain processes which are for multiple people, while at the same time trying to treat people as individuals. So getting that line right, I think, is a real challenge.
Yeah.
So it sounds like it's a bit of sort of like, you can use the data, but you've got to keep your feet in the ground. And I suppose for Anna and Donna, get your perspectives, like, how do we take a step back and keep our feet in the ground in terms of what's important when we're sort of integrating new processes, new customer journeys, from a customer point of view, I suppose. Anna, do you want to go first?
Yeah, absolutely. Just want a couple of the points that have already been raised. I would reiterate that. I think that sort of that almost testing piece and seeing what difference does that make, and what are any unintended consequences, what are the benefits there, and making sure that that's happening. And also, listening to customers and your feedback, and having those assurance processes and the right governance structures around that is really critical. And I think also, drawing compliance into those discussions. One of the things that's great to actually see these days, much more than we used to, is that at the beginning of these new product designs or whatever you're working on, is that compliance are there from the outset, really, in many organisations. I think that's absolutely critical, because we shouldn't be looking at them, back in the day, perhaps compliance and the operations sort of used to rub up against each other, and it was trying to actually, we're now seeing so much more where we're working together. So, and that compliance teams are innovative, and they want to say yes, because they want to, to support the business. And I think that's just such a critical piece as well, in terms of helping the business to move forward, but having that eye on the customer all the time, and everyone being open to that process.
And Don, what's your perspective in terms of, designing great customer journeys? I mean, how do you keep firms' feet on the ground in terms of doing that? And coming back to, I suppose, what's important? I mean, what are the principles that you would certainly advocate?
Well, there's kind of the data you as a company can collect regarding, what have you seen as the best times to reach out to someone? What are kind of life events, or if it's an application or a process of, origination of some sort, what are the events that you may have to reach out for them? And then there's, from a, sort of regulatory standpoint, there's a lot more, I would say, customer experience regulations coming into play regarding what is harassment, how to prevent it, and you need to honor those. But, what I've seen over the last couple of years is that in reality, and those are good for kind of high level decisioning and bucketing and planning, but ultimately it's ask the person what they're interested in. How do they want to be contacted? For what events do they want to be notified? For example, say it's past origination, and do they want to be notified? Hey, your statement just dropped, or you have a payment due. How many days beforehand do you want? Do you want to be just texted? Do you want to receive an email? Do you want to call? And as far as what are the convenient times to contact you, don't contact me on, Monday and Wednesdays at this time. If it's during this day on this time, text me instead. So it's, and one, it makes your organization more efficient on the resources that you have, because you have to keep your agents and customer care folks happy, because when they're happy, they, the people they contact have a better experience. If they're frustrated and down or depressed, it has an impact on them. I mean, one, it's, you have to maintain their health as well, because it's hard to maintain folks nowadays, as far as the competition for employees is almost as much or hard, more dog eat dog than the competition for customers. So you have to manage both sides of the equation so that the people that are your customers have a good experience. But ultimately, I think it's asking them, what do they want? So obviously sometimes you have to intervene separate from that, but trying to honor their wishes. What we found is they will view those interactions not so much as confrontational, but more as a customer experience engagement, when you take into account things that they've requested.
And I suppose part of your process, you have to have a process to then record what the preferences are as well, and then be able to then feed that back.
Exactly. You have to have the facilities to, one, capture it. You have to build in with your folks the processes and the habits to ask and to reach out, and sometimes even probe, because sometimes customers haven't, if depending on where they came from, I hate to be stereotypical, but sometimes younger folks expect it, but necessarily some of the older generation may not, because they've used to be dealing with monolithic, almost governmental kind of entities, and that's different, and they're not always aware that these options are available to them now. That's changing, but there is some of that dichotomy. But then you have to, once again, have those systems behind the scenes to be able to track and manage that information, so that it's not a manual process, but a supportive process for your agents.
So do you think the customer, and this is to Tim and Francis, do you think the customer experience is almost like fragmenting, just as Don's kind of explaining, into like different demographics, and they have different expectations around what the journeys should be?
Yeah, absolutely. I think it's actually the last 18 months has been quite, I say, helpful in that sense, because there's been such a migration to online by necessity. So demographics who weren't used to using things like apps or web journeys now are migrating onto those platforms, and that's made that easier. But I know in one of my previous role as a fashion retailer, you could phone up a customer who in their 90s, and there was no way you could convince them to use an app to do things. But at the same time, you want to get in new customers of a coming through from the Gen Z demographic. They're not going to call someone. We're almost talking to someone. It's almost foreign to that demographic, and that's obviously very needlessly reductive. But so there's a huge. I think it is still largely, at least in the UK, an age-based splintering more than anything else. I mean, I'm sure there are other demographics you could split along as well. But predominantly, I think the younger you are, the more likely you are to want to interact through an app or through a chat service, or to go onto the marketing kind of side, you'd be more likely to be marketed by through places like TikTok or social media. Whereas the older you get, more likely through traditional media and maybe television ads. So that kind of demographic split, I think, very much still leading in. But I think it is going inevitably, it's going in the direction of lighter, less human interaction and more data-driven or social media interaction rather than app interaction.
John, did you want to jump in with a thought?
I just want to make clear there is, you can have generic kind of statistics on the different demographic stuff, but just to reiterate what we've kind of seen over the past 18 months, 2 years is really asking the person, how do they want to be acted? Because as much as demographics work, but there's always going to be a reasonable percentage that don't fit within their demographic. So asking the person, how do they want to be engaged? When do you want to be engaged? For what reasons they want to be engaged? If it's this event happening, I want to be notified. If it's another, I don't really care about that kind of scenario. But it's actually asking them, how do they want to engage with your company? And then following up and supporting that. If you just ask and you don't follow up on it, they will get ticked off and they will leave.
Just to jump on that, I think we just completely reflecting what you're saying. We are now fully blown in the convenience revolution, and one of the key principles of that we expect is an increasingly personalized experience. So as we have more data analytics, the way things are going is that whoever that individual is, we have enough increasing data that we're able to profile, understand them, and present them with the information they want. Being in control is a key part of what we now expect, and to personalize things in the way we want them. And that benefits everyone, because if we feel we've chosen something and we feel that we're in control, we've said, I would like to be notified at this time. I'd like to manage my learning this way. I'd like to have it on this term. People are then more likely to be more engaged. They're more likely to have affinity with your brand, and it actually helps everyone because it reduces operational pressure. Because, for example, you're not chasing someone when you don't need to. You're actually, it's all scheduled, it's planned because that person feels they've decided, so it benefits everyone. And I think, and interestingly, and I think something that I've definitely been looking at recently is the difference in preferences in different age groups and different types is really important for the experience, but also in terms of, for example, online banking. Older cohorts like baby boomer generation are much less likely and more risk conscious about open banking, whereas younger audiences are much more open, but they're in a different life stage. They're more concerned about, can I actually get credit? They're used to just everything being one click simple, and they will prefer convenience over risk concerns. So you've got a very different approach, and again, that feeds in with that individual's actual behavior and what you know about them. You can really customize and give them the relevant options that suits them. And I think, again, on a slightly separate note, attitudes towards finance in different life stages is different. So, for example, someone who is young is more concerned about their credit record, for example. Like younger people, millennials and Gen Z are very concerned about that, for example, more than someone of the older generation. So that again comes into it in terms of how you the customer experience, also how your messaging and what you're saying and what you're offering. And I think these are all quite interesting changes. And also what we're saying about having a frictionless journey, getting that right balance between a human brand that, technology should deliver what a human can in a more effective way. It shouldn't take away any of those brand values and characteristics and that feeling. But I think what's really important is, for example, younger people, they actually are more likely to want to speak to a real individual at a certain time than someone, not an older person, a baby boomer, for example. So that's also interesting. The young people that have been brought up with everything being digital, we're more concerned about their finances. At some point, they're more worried. They want to actually speak to someone. So I think this offers loads of opportunities to create value-adding experiences that allow lenders to differentiate.
And with the extra complexity, I suppose, around things like contact channels and affordability data, those kind of things, and we talked a little bit about demographics, is there a sense around it's becoming quite fragmented? How do we make sure that do we have to offer service for all? I mean, is there going to be segments of the population that are going to be underserved? Is that a concern? Maybe Anna, I'll go to you in terms of comment around. Is that something we've got to be conscious of, or is that natural, or is that something we're not going to get into? Going to avoid
about having those underserved. I think it's about having that eye, and if you're developing something, a service, a product, that understanding how is this going to fit with your customer base, how are they going to be impacted by that, and taking steps to mitigate it. I think ultimately is what we need to do as organisations.
Yeah. Okay. And in terms of, I suppose, we're just on contact channels. I mean, the question just coming in around the best customer engagement channels when assessing affordability. I mean, has anyone got any thoughts on that? It's quite a good question in terms of, is it, I mean, we talked about calls. We talked about digital. I mean, we talked a little bit about open banking there, which is almost like just getting, remote data. I mean, is there are there specific contacts or technology that you think are preferred or we should be looking at?
I think the question is best for whom. Talking about, I mean, that's going to depend on the business, on the customer, and what perspective you look at. Best for the customer will be, from their perspective, the one that gets them the credit they want. But best from a business, that depends on how they operate, their business model, their culture, who their demographic applicants are, by and large, what the risk profile that they operate in, the sector that they operate in, all these kind of things. If you operate as in my previous role as a low cost credit that were operating at the risky end of the market, the best channel that was found there was predominantly one button click and a whole raft of stuff going on in the background with, scorecards and credit checks and risk profiles and fraud checks and a whole load of other things that the customer just never got to see, because the business model there was to get a small amount of rolling credit out to the customer quickly. So for us, in that scenario, that was the best. But if you're operating in car finance, that's almost certainly not going to be the best channel for you to operate on, which might be in person, either on phone or in a dealership or something completely different. So it's really difficult to talk about what the best engagement channel would be, because it would depend on the customer and the business.
I agree. I think it really is about for who, because we're talking about, it depends what your outcome is. Is it because you just want to actually, lend anything to anybody and get that out of the door, or actually are we talking about responsible lending and getting the right outcome for the customer? So how is that particular customer going to engage with you, and how are you going to get the best out of them? So if we talk about that example Tim just gave, that one click piece, actually it's all of that information that they have available that enables them to make that right sort of decision for that customer, and understanding their customer base or their target customer base, I think. Or it may well be that, depending on the product or the type of customer that you have, that it is that face-to-face piece that will work better. So I think it really is about that for who, and the how.
I want to just mention one thing. There's the channel interactions once you have that first communication with the customer, and then through any kind of an origination process, and then afterwards. But one channel that I think is often overlooked is your online or offline presence, because whether it's customers now are often very well informed prior to the initial face-to-face or voice-to-voice or text-to-text communication. Whether it's doing research on your company through your website, looking at customer reviews, using an application that actually provides references and your score relative to your competitors. So I think it's more. There's a lot of the customer, and not in all instances, but for a larger and larger percentage of the population, where they're making a choice, and shopping for you. As much or more than you're accepting them, yes or no. That's happening before you have any awareness, unless you're tracking these different mechanisms, that they are in that process. Especially with a lot of these, more whether it's a website or whether it's an application that provides preferences. What's the best lender for X? What's the best lender for your company? And doing a bunch of comparative research from that viewpoint. So there's a lot more interaction with you as a company and your statistics and your data and your history and your customer references that goes on before you may even be aware of it. And so you just need to be aware of your presence in that realm as well.
Yeah, and so I mean, outside, I suppose we talked a bit about open banking, income and expenditure. I mean, are there other tools out there for assessing affordability that you think are definitely worth looking at? Maybe Francis, I think you talked a bit about some of the stuff that you were doing, but do we need to broaden our perspectives even further?
I think open banking is obviously very interesting in terms of how that benefits the customer. So, for example, we found that even just on a small trial, we were able to fund customers through open banking 50% faster, for example. And by incorporating more data, historical customer data, obviously with AI, machine learning, you're getting more intelligent about the historic customer data and new customer data coming in, which you're then optimizing. So I think we've all got a lot of data that we can use, and it's about, there's much more to tap into. So I think and open banking was sort of obviously just the beginning of that, and that obviously interestingly linked with the pandemic, that's kind of accelerated things, because we needed to know when people were they may have fit the standard model, but did they actually have that money at the time? So I think there are, increasingly this is about your algorithm weighting the right factors in the right way and getting all the right people involved to pull that together and the right processes in place. I think in terms of other tools, so from our point of view, we've got our external data, like for tax, CRA, etc., work verification. We then got the historic customer data, which detects patterns. And so we can use that to actually group and find commonalities, then combining that with what the customer declares. Obviously, the more data you have in, the more accurate you're going to be, because there's less likely to be error, and the faster you can make a decision and a more accurate decision. So I think we've all got a lot to do. I think in terms of talking about the underserved, the difficulty there is there are, for example, groups who are less likely to use open banking, for example. So I think those are all interesting. It's like, what data do we have on people? There's also the cookie laws, GDPR. So from an experience point of view, what is the data that we potentially can't get as well, and how will that affect things? But I think in terms of, as I was saying, there's a lot we can do with what we already have. And I think with open banking, we're sort of at the beginning of that. And payment, what's on the payment side?
And I suppose with the data sort of expanding like that, and things moving very fast. How do you think? What from a regulatory point of view, is it keeping up? Is it introducing barriers? So, for example, transparency is one of the things we talked about on one of the other sessions. Is it introducing barriers to be able to use that data? Is that a good thing, or is that actually a great thing in some ways? Any thoughts on that? Maybe Anna or Tim?
Yeah, well, the regulatory side is always an interesting one to take. There's always a conflict between what business would like to do and what regulations would allow them to do. And regulations, particularly on the FCA I'm talking about here, are deliberately, in some cases, quite vague in order to force businesses to make their own risk assessments. The FCA has always said it doesn't want to tell people where the benchmarks are, because then businesses will all just go up to the benchmark and operate there, and that doesn't give them what they want to see as a customer-centric approach. But I think to link this back to the previous question, the FCA approach is that while the availability of data is expanding, all businesses now mostly can kind of pick their own data that they think is pretty good at picking the data that indicates what they think is a good lending assessment. But where I think the expansion is now is for actually business culture itself to operate in a way that serves the needs of its customers. If you go back 20 years at the FSA, was the very commercial nature of get all the money out, get as much you can out to people and make all the money you can. Obviously, I'm generalizing there. I don't want to put anything on businesses anyone's worked for, but I've certainly seen businesses that used to operate in that fashion. But the change in business culture to be, we want to do the best things for our customers because it's sustainable and because it's the right thing to do, you're automatically going to then be in a position to meet regulatory requirements for good affordability assessments.
Because you're doing the right thing. You're
exactly right. Yeah.
And it benefits everyone. Everyone's better off. I think that's
right,
bridging that together. Everyone's on the same page and we're all better off. I think open banking, especially, and better transparency and data will help that to be the case more so in the future.
So we're almost at time. I'm going to sort of cut us short a little bit there. So we're almost at time, and I suppose just the final question then is, what do you think the future is of lending? I suppose the customer journey, assessing affordability, and if we were to sort of draw an arc out in sort of like 5 years' time, in one sentence. I tried 3 words earlier, and we just couldn't do it in 3 words. But in one sentence, what will it look like if we were to have this meeting in 5 years' time? And what do you think the customer journey will look like? Anna, should we start with yourself and then we'll go around? What would you like it to look like?
Oh, wow. In one sentence, that's a big ask. I think it will look inclusive, or it needs to look inclusive, which is a big subject in itself. So yeah, lending needs, and the customer journey needs to look inclusive, and it needs to work for all. That's my one sentence for you.
Yeah. Francis?
I think it'll be more precise, embedded and integrated. So that's not a sentence, but very integrated. So things will be increasingly intuitive, so rather than just going and getting a loan. It'll be part of that person's journey. It'll be one click simple or even less.
Simple, much more seamless, yeah.
Much more seamless and personalised and totally relevant to what that person wants, and value adding. So it'll add something more to give that person something rather than just. So in terms of the convenience, for example, or giving them the money exactly when they need it, it'll be much more. It will be much more intuitive and automatic and instant.
And Tim?
Yeah, I kind of agree with that. I think from a business perspective, I mean, 5 years is quite a short time horizon for this kind of level of tech integration. But the increasing reliance on data science, AI, machine learning, that's going to explode into affordability, I think, and that's what's going to drive most lending decisions, I think, in the future, certainly in the medium time horizon.
Okay, and Don, final thoughts?
I think it's going to be a customer directed journey where each person will have as much or maybe more say in how their journey and what is important to their journey is decided relative to the individual lenders having that say previously because of monolithic systems that had pre-existed.
Yeah, it's much more tailored. Well, for you, thank you very much. It's been great to have you all join the panel today. It's really interesting insight. Really appreciate it. Yeah, thank you very much. And Colin, we're going to hand back to you now.
Thank you.
Lovely. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, no, that's really good. Really interesting to hear all of those views from different angles as well, which is always interesting. Everybody has a different take, obviously, on what's going on. So really, really good. Thank you for that. Yeah, we're running short on time, so just want to round up and just let people know we're running our next session on, ironically, open banking and the future of lending in our next session, which will start at 1 p.m. So if you're interested in joining us on that one, that'll be available at 1 p.m. You just need to log in via our registration. This session's been recorded, so we'll share that online at some point on demand. So if anybody wants to watch that back or has got any questions, then please let us know. As I mentioned, we'll round up some of the poll results and questions that we've had throughout this one. So that'd be great to get everybody's input on that. But for now, we'll round up and say thank you to everybody who's been part of this session. And obviously, say a big thank you to Chris, to Don, Anna, Francis, and Tim. And we look forward to seeing you at the next event, which could be face-to-face or online soon. So thanks, everybody, and goodbye. Thanks.
Great. Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.